Good morning, everyone. I'm Patrick Huston. I'm an Army veteran here in San Francisco, and I wanted to start by thanking all of you for joining us. I'm going to echo Claudia's thanks for Dr. Keith Dorsey and Boyden for sponsoring the event. As Claudia said, Keith is an Air Force veteran himself, but also a very accomplished board director who came out this year on NACD's very prestigious B100 list as one of the top 100 directors in the country. So thank you to them for sponsoring it. Okay, now on to our main event. I can't think of a better way to follow Memorial Day weekend than to hear from today's special guest, Herman Bulls. Herman is an absolute legend in both the NACD and the military communities. He's been on dozens of boards. I'm going to read from the list here, including USAA, where he's the vice chair, JLL Americas, where he's the vice chair, Fluence Energy, where he's the chair, Host Hotels, Comfort Systems, Tyco, the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board, the American Red Cross, the West Point Association of Graduates, where he's the vice chair, and many others. Herman also retired from the Army as a colonel after a very distinguished career, and he's received countless awards and recognitions, including the Alabama Business Hall of Fame, the International Business Executive of the Year from BYU's Marriott Business School, the most influential Black directors, and also he was on the prestigious NACD D100 list. Welcome, Herman. It's fantastic to have you with us here today.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's an honor to be here.
Great. Herman, will you just share your journey with us? Tell us, where it started and maybe some of the key waypoints along the way.
Oh, sure, Patrick. And I just want to thank the Northern California chapter. So, Claudia, thank you for your very warm welcome. And Lisa, you and your team have done just an excellent job. And I have had the opportunity to go around to several chapters, and I just want to know the chapter members to know how fortunate you are to have such great leadership, because that's really going to be the theme of what we talk about today, Patrick. Everything in my life has been around leadership. And speaking of that, I'm from Alabama. You mentioned the Alabama Business Hall of Fame, which is, I've received a few honors, but that one was special to me, particularly recognizing that I'm a kid of the 60s, really, from Alabama. And for those of you who are not aware what that was like, I can remember vividly some things. And I'm going to start with my family. My mom, I'm the youngest of seven, and this will mean something a little later. Six of those kids finished college with a total of 11 degrees. Let me tell you why that is so important in this situation. I was born in 1956. Unfortunately, my father, who was a janitor at the Tennessee Valley Authority, as well as a farmer, back in those days, people had to do gig jobs. We didn't have that word then, but do gig jobs basically to survive, in essence. And my dad was going from one parcel of our farm to another, and unfortunately, he was involved in an automobile accident. He was killed instantly. That happened in October of 1955, and I was born in February 1956. So my mother, pregnant at the time, 6 kids, no high school diploma education at that time, and there she was. And you talk about inspiration, as I have learned and experienced a story from that very powerful and influential lady. And those of you from the South know that, it takes a village is kind of one of the mantras of that. Said, hey, Lucy Bell, her name is Lucy Bell. Lucy Bell, I'll take one. She said, no, I'm keeping my family together. Long story short, over the years, she went back and got her GED while working 3 jobs. She was a cook at a local restaurant. She was a domestic, and she also did premium collections for Atlanta Life Insurance Company. And back in those days, people would pay a nickel a dime, a quarter a week, and she was the person that would drive around to pick up the money and mail it to Atlanta. And despite that, after she finished her GED, she would 3 days a week go to Athens to the junior college, drive up there 70 miles round trip, do her coursework, and she finally became a licensed practical nurse, an LPN. And you know what? I've never considered myself poor or underprivileged. And I guess when you look back on it, particularly when you're on a farm, you got food, you got your neighbors, and everybody around you is the same. We didn't have 1,000 channels, so I didn't know what the Kardashians were doing in California. So, it was just there. And playing on the farm. So we moved to Florence, Alabama from Center Star. And this was kind of the start of the journey, Patrick. I'm this little skinny black kid, and the coach let me go out for basketball team. I made the basketball team. And I'm going to take a little detour here. There are things that really impact your life. I can remember back in those days as we would drive to town, the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, for those of you who may not be familiar, they would be kind of like the firemen with their boots. They would be there with buckets and their hoods, and they would be on the side of the road taking donations. And they wouldn't bother you, but in retrospect, it could have been very intimidating. I can recall going to the movie theater, and probably until I was probably 8 or 9 years old, blacks couldn't go on the first floor. You had to go in a side door, and you had to go upstairs to watch the movie theater. I can recall being in public places and restrooms, whites only, water fountains, whites only. And probably one of the most indignant ones that I can recall is when you had a chance to go out for a meal, you go to the restaurant, and guess what you have to do? Have to order your food in the back and pick it up because you couldn't go inside to eat it. So those are foundational elements that, stay with me to this day, not in anger, but in an understanding of what it takes to persevere and make things happen. So I go through there. I'm very fortunate that my mother made me study, so I was a decent student. And those of you from the South know that Friday night lights and football is what it's all about. And I was fortunate to be a quarterback. I was the first starting black quarterback for my high school, which was 16% black. I also was the first Black Student Council president. And it brings me to one of the things that I have noted in life. Life is about connecting. I can remember some things about that were challenging, that I was called an Oreo. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it's a derogatory term within the African American community, which means you're black on the outside, but you're white on the inside. And it bothered me somewhat, but I just had this guiding star saying that people and connections are so important. And you can imagine with 16% black votes, black population in the school, I had to have connected with at least enough to get 51% of the vote. And I tell you, there were 3 people running, and I was fortunate enough to win. So I was Bowie State, had all these great things. I also had the record in the high jump, 3rd in the state, played baseball and basketball as well. And Patrick, that's where your and my journey kind of coincides, in that you look there. I can remember actually being a 16, 17-year-old kid, and people are telling you how great you're going to be. And that is a burden, I got to tell you. And I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And then for me, fortunately, the service academies started to recruit me for academics as well as athletics. So I chose to attend West Point and attended West Point, played football there for a couple of years. Then we were testing. I was messing with Lisa, and we were doing a micro test. I said, WKDT 89.3 Serial FM, the Rock of the Hudson. And of course, Patrick knows what that is. That's our cadet radio station. So I continued doing the broadcasting, where I actually, for my last 2 years, became the voice of Army sports. And one of the people that wrote a letter of recommendation to me for the Alabama Business Hall of Fame was this guy named Coach K, Mike Krzyzewski. So he was the basketball coach. I had a radio show. My claim to fame, he and I are friends now, my claim to fame is he called me to ask to be on my radio show. Of course, this is before he became who he is to this day. But those types of relationships and friendships are just phenomenal. And from there, from West Point, Patrick, something will mean something to you. I went to Ranger School, and I tell you, I think you have limitations. And when you go to Ranger School, the physical, the mental duress and pressure that you're under, it just makes you see that your limitations are actually further than you think they are. And I think during times of crisis, it helps you, makes you calmer and able to do things. And entered the Army, and we'll talk about some of the Army stuff later. So,
well, that was astounding. So many different ways we can go from there. I want to ask you about your bid to be president of the United States, but I think we'll put that on hold for a moment. And let's take this Army thread. This is a veterans event. How did the Army shape you, especially about your transition into the corporate world? Because I know that came later, but I've got to imagine that there was some influence on your leadership style and your values as you transitioned to the corporate sector. Can you share some of that,
Yeah,
journey?
yeah. I'll start with kind of a foundational aspect that you and I are both familiar with. Mission first. You've got to get it accomplished. People always. You've got to be aware of your people and what they're doing. And as I think of the Army, probably one of the foundational assignments that I had after a year in the Army, I went back to West Point and I served in the admissions office doing something we call Project Outreach, which was an effort to make sure that we attracted and retained more minority cadets. And my area was the Southeast United States. And for a year, I would be on the road for a week, back at West Point processing files for a week. And during that time, Patrick, I had the opportunity to talk to from one person to 2,000, radio, TV. I wasn't that good. However, if you do something every day, repetition is important. You become very good at it. So I had that opportunity. And I think that really, and I'm going to talk later about some keys to success. And I think communication skills will be one of the things that I talk about that was critical. Another thing, Patrick, is, and this, I think of Claudia here, being a professor, it's one of the best jobs in the world. It can also be one of the most horrifying jobs in the world because you're getting up in front of some of the brightest, these kids at West Point. I taught finance and economics at West Point. And I'm a MBA from that other school that Claudia said we couldn't mention on the East Coast. And she uses all of her case studies, but I won't say what school it is. It's just a well-known Eastern business school. And in any event, you get on that platform and you've got some kid that has done super involved research on a subject that they're very interested in, and you've got to be on your toes. And at the same time, and I think this is another thing that's important for success, you've also got to be authentic, okay? You don't say you know something, you don't know it. And to this day, kids that I taught, and I probably, in the reserve time I was at West Point, I taught 2,000 to 3,000 kids, and they pop up all the time. And Claudia, I know you know this is such a gratifying feeling when they come up and they'll actually remember something you said. And one claim to fame I had, nobody very seldom went to sleep in my class because I'm a little energetic. And of course, at West Point, we're fortunate the classes are, 14 to 16 kids. So it's a very intimate environment. So teaching there had it to do. We talked about the Ranger School and the leadership aspect that did. Then having the opportunity to serve in the Pentagon. And what life is about is coordination and collaboration. And if you think of this defense industry and network that we have that is so important, it's so big, it's so complex. However, the secret is to try to make things as simple as you can so people can understand what it is they're supposed to do to go toward that. And you mentioned earlier that, I've had a few pinch myself moments, and you mentioned the Defense Policy Board. So I was very fortunate. The current Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, he and I were cadets together at West Point, and we've become friends over the years as well, and so proud of him and what he's doing. And he gave me a call, and I got to tell you, usually when we talk, we called each other's cell phone. And this time the call went through my assistant. And you joked about the presidency, Patrick, and I thought he might have been, this was my ego talking, he might have been calling me to perhaps come and do a job for him full time. So we had the call, we had a little chit chat, et cetera, how's the family, blah, blah, blah. And then he asked me, he said, Herman, I would be honored if you would serve. And I said, oh my gosh, he's going to ask me to do something. And he said, on the Defense Policy Board. And for those of you who are not familiar with that organization, it is a phenomenal group of people that advise the Secretary and the Undersecretary for Policy on all issues related to the defense posture of our nation. And when I joined the board, Madeleine Albright was chairman of the board. Henry Kissinger until his staff last year, I sat next to him a couple of times. I mean, these are those moments where you sit there and you say, wait a minute, I'm this country boy from Alabama. What am I doing in this room? And at the same time, and I think this is apropos for us talking about being on boards, at the same time, feel qualified to be there, right? Have the confidence, because what got you there is what's going to make you successful. But that was those types of experiences. And then again, having the opportunity to lead in the Army, because everything we do, it's not about the gadgets. Certainly the gadgets do it. And AI is going to, we can talk about that a little later, is going to make it easier to do it. However, fundamentally, it's still going to come down to people and leadership.
That's amazing journey. I can't imagine getting a phone call like that. You've talked about your background, but we haven't specifically gone into the diversity efforts. Can you talk a little bit about diversity from either the military perspective or perhaps more importantly to this audience, the corporate perspective, and some thoughts on that?
Well, let's start with the military. And I think the military has paved the way in a lot of ways in terms of diversity. And we know from the Tuskegee Airmen to the Buffalo Soldiers, what these individuals and organizations did to provide for our freedom and understanding how important it is to have diverse representation. And Patrick, let me tell you how I explain in the boardroom. You mentioned some of the boards I've been on. I think I've been on 7 or 8 public company boards at least. And this is what I say in the boardroom. And many times, and Claudia may identify with this, being the only one, right? So the expectation is when a diversity question comes up, or maybe for Claudia gender, the first thing people do is, look to you and see what you're going to say. And what I do in my boardroom work, and I am a super component supporter of diversity, from the Executive Leadership Council, which we spoke about which is a group of, probably close to 1,000 of the leading Black executives in the United States and around the world, to Direct Women, which is a group that focuses on women attorneys, which Patrick, I'm the faculty member for that. Women 50-50. I've been on that board for the last 4 or 5 years. So when I say diversity, I'm thinking about it. Certainly we think of race and gender. One of the things I do at USAA, not only for the service members, but also their spouses. And I'm there. But this is why diversity is important. And let's talk about the United States from this perspective. If you look at the Census Bureau data, the kids under 18 right now, majority of the people in the United States are people of color. So make that as fact point number 1. Number 2, somewhere between 2040 and 2045, the majority of people in America are going to be people of color. And I say the following: who is going to make the products and innovate? Who's going to sell the products? And more importantly, who's going to buy the products? If you do not have a diverse perspective in your boardroom to talk specifically about that, to understand where markets are, and that great philosopher Wayne Gretzky says, you got to skate to where the puck is going to be. Okay? And I think that is so important for diversity. So that's how I explain diversity. If you try to do it as a social remedy, you can certainly go that route, but we've been doing that for 100 years and it hasn't made a difference. If you do it from the perspective of this is how you make the pie bigger for everyone, I think people understand that. And I'm outspoken. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I do in the boardroom, you get this voluminous amount of information, you got to review it or whatever. Get yourself a board buddy and say, hey, did you see XYZ? Yeah, I saw that. Well, I tell you what, why don't you bring that up? And you're not always the person speaking that people get conditioned that if something diversity come up, you're going to talk about it. And another thing I do is if Claudia and I were on the board together, we would become board buddies, so to speak. And I'm going to talk about women issues. Okay, so think about that. Remember I pulled that election thing off in high school with a 16% demographic. Okay, you've got to have alliances and you pull people together, and that is just so important.
That's fantastic advice. And well, since we're on the topic of underrepresented groups, and this is a veterans event, let's bring that back to the underrepresented group that is veterans. Any advice for the veterans in the audience, or perhaps the members of non-gov committees in the audience, about veterans and how they can make that transition?
Just last Tuesday, I participated in another NACD event called Battlefield to Boardroom, which is for flag and general officers who are just phenomenally talented individuals, and teaching them what corporate governance is, right? We know the command and control of military, however, learning the corporate governance and how to do it. So something, again, I'm very, very supportive of. If you think about it and you look at the complex issues that these individuals have been associated with, the fact that they're phenomenal leaders, they may not have the cost accounting down. They may not have the marketing. They sort of understand it because they got to recruit. They won't have some of the technical terms down. But I got to tell you, from a analytic perspective, they're phenomenal. Now, Patrick, I'm going to use this to talk about the 6 traits that I think are important for anyone to be successful. And I think this is important. I shared this with the general and flag officers, and just putting it in a capsule to think about it. Actually, it's applicable to anyone. And the first one I talk about is your interpersonal skills. And interpersonal skills, I don't necessarily mean being an extrovert. The interpersonal skills to me is your curiosity to be a continuous learner. Think about that. So you go into an event, if it's a military event, how can you talk to the private and the general and know something about it? How can you at a corporate event talk to the wait staff? And by the way, if you ever are with me at a corporate event, you're going to see me talking to the wait staff some period of time. And you know why? It reminds me of my mother, because that's what she did. And when I ask them, hey, how was your day? Do you have kids? And we're all familiar with the invisible man concept, okay? And when you do that, be aware of the people that are around you. And little things you say can have such a profound impact on their day. Because I can only imagine my mom doing what she did. And then she obviously didn't tell me these things, but I'm imagining it. It makes such a difference to someone's life. So that curiosity, interpersonal, relating to people is critical. Communication, I talked about earlier, okay? And I talked that down into 3 areas. And somebody last week, I was giving a speech and they put 4th one. The first one is speaking. When I came on the film today, you guys thought something. Claudia thought I was from that well-known Eastern Business School, but we all thought something. The next thing that is important is from communication is your writing ability. And this is more so for the young kids who are doing all of the initials, and you got to learn how to write. That's important. And then the most important one, and my mom told me this, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, sometimes use them in that proportion. And that's the concept of listening, because we're more profound, at least adapted to thinking what we're going to say next, as opposed to listening to the person. And one of the things I do there, Patrick, I try, and I'm not perfect, I'm pretty good at it. I try to take the word but out of my vocabulary. I agree with Patrick, but as soon as I say but, Patrick, your brain is doing something else. What is he going to say? Why is he going to say it? And very simple, just substitute the word and for but. And you keep Patrick's attention during the time. And one other person said the other thing to be adapted to in communication skill is the body language. So watch the person you're talking to, be aware of your own body language, okay? Some people, I remember one CEO of a company I was with on the board, we would say something that might be critical, whatever, he went to do all this. I pulled him aside and said, you can't do that, okay? You've got to be able to have a solemn view, because you're communicating something that is unintended, and that's important. Then we talk about what's so important, analytical skills. And I think our military leaders have phenomenal analytical skills. And I don't mean just being able to solve a geometric equation. That's also the qualitative aspects of it. And I think they have that to bring to the table. Leadership, we can talk about all day, right? And I define leadership very simply, is the ability to influence a group to accomplish a common goal. And if you think about what a leader does. And sometimes you lead from the back, sometimes from the middle, and sometimes from the front. But keeping it all about the leadership and accomplishing the goal and seeing focus on the mission. And this is one that I can tell you military officers have somewhat of a problem with, or a challenge, I should say, and that's entrepreneurship or risk taking. Okay, because their careers, I mean, Patrick, you and I know that we became second lieutenants. We had an idea of everything we needed to do in your case to make general officer. You know, based on your specialty, what you need to do to get it. Well, the civilian world is not quite like that. And you've got to be able to take risk. However, we don't take unmitigated risk, right? I like to say I jump out of airplanes, but yeah, I have a parachute and a spare. Okay, so and even though the officers are working in probably what could be considered one of the most dangerous professions in the world, when it comes to these career decisions, it's a little unusual. And I've spoken to no less than 50 general officers, probably more, that have transitioned, and helping them to understand how important that is. And then we take all of that, and I think it's important to put around that passion for what you're doing, because that's what motivates people around you, attracts people to you, and makes you more effective in terms of being a part of an organization and helping that organization achieve its goal.
Absolutely fantastic advice. Exactly what I was expecting to hear from you. And then some. The importance of the personal touch. Your natural leadership is so evident. Some of the stuff you just mentioned is a perfect transition into a couple of the questions that have come up. I'd like to start getting some audience questions, give folks an opportunity to check in with you with what's on their mind. The first one I'm going to share is from Susan Gibson out there. And again, you've started to touch on this. She asks for some tips on how to sell your military experience and transition this into this commercial or the corporate context. Anything else that you want to share there?
Sure. Well, Susan, one of the first things I would say is have someone look at your board bio, and please understand the difference, and I'm certain you guys do it in the chapter, difference between a board bio and your professional bio. Okay, your professional bio, chronological, you're talking about all these great things you did, et cetera, et cetera. The board bio, remember, what we're looking for in a boardroom is we're looking for someone not to answer questions. Your role is to ask the question, and ask the right question, and demonstrating your ability to see around corners. Okay, if you think of it, what your two most important roles you're going to do as a board member, what are they going to be? They're going to be, number one, selecting that CEO. Claudia and I were talking about one of her CEOs earlier today and how important that is. You're not there all the time. You're there 4 times, probably 5 if you have a strategy session per year. And in the meantime, that chief executive officer is truly the chief executive officer. And you've got to pick a good one. And guess what you do after you pick a good one? You start planning for the next one right away, because succession planning is part of that process and so critically important. Then the second thing that you do is you're showing your ability to approve a strategy. Notice I didn't say establish a strategy, because I'm chair of a board now, and I'm going to tell you, being on a board is one thing. Being chair of a committee is even more responsibility. When you're chair of the board, the only thing you have to look up to really are the stockholders, the shareholders, and they're not talking to you every day. So this idea of you're confident without being arrogant, right? That's so important. And let's think about something else. Generally, you all are probably aware of what's called the board matrix. So we've got the functional areas that this organization needs. We've got the names, and we've got checkbox. Don't be the person that has functional expertise in 17 things, okay? Be the person that concentrates on what your functional expertise is. Now, let me tell you something else that's important as you think about this board process. The area that is your functional expertise is probably going to come up 10, maybe 20% of the time. So what do you do for that other 80% of the time? Boards looking for people with those analytical skills that I spoke about earlier. How do you take an issue for which you are not an expert, evaluate it, come to some conclusion, and I talked about communication skills, then communicate your viewpoint on it in a concise and effective manner. And sometimes those of us in the military, we're so detailed oriented, right? We want to talk about, day one, we're going to do blah, blah, blah. Have that ability to encapsulate. And I'm going to use storytelling in a sense, because it's just so important for people to be able to follow you, for you to be able to tell a story. So the communication skills on how to do that. And then the point I said about having someone look at your board bio, please take the acronyms out. Okay? Yes, you served at NATO, and maybe everybody knows what NATO is. Make it, you don't want to overdo it and say that you were the president of the battalion. Okay, you can say commander. However, all the other little things that you've been doing for 30, 35 years that means something to you, have somebody that has nothing to do with the military look at it and make sure you go. So everything I talked about, interpersonal skills, right? And the interpersonal skills I talked about, let me tell you, I start my day each day with a minimum of 30 minutes, but I try to, if I'm really lucky, I can take an hour and a half. And this goes back to my professorial days of reading different sources, staying up to date on what is going on. And I'm so fortunate of the different industries. I'm in financial services. I'm in real estate. I'm in HVAC mechanical contracting. I'm in education technology. I'm in energy. And let me tell you, this is the best one for the military people here. And what someone's going to ask, how do you get on a board? So the board that I'm chair of, let me tell you how that came about. I was actually interviewing to be on another board, and I'll say what the board was, AES. And it came down between me and another person, and I was not selected. Well, when that happens to you, you don't take your ball home and run and cry. You write a nice note, and you thank the people for the opportunity that you had to meet them. And I'd say probably 6 months, a year later, another board opportunity came up. And the person who was chair of the board at AES was on this other board. And my name came up. He said, oh, that's the guy we ought to get. So that was Host Hotels. So I'm on the Host Hotels board. Then this company called Fluence Energy, which is a joint venture between AES and Siemens, the big German conglomerate. They had asked me to consider being on the board. And at the time, it was during COVID, and unfortunately, my wife was sick, and I lost her to pancreatic cancer 3 years ago yesterday, as a matter of fact. And at the time, I said, no, I'm sorry. I'm kind of, busy with some personal things. And they were very smart. And this is a good lesson on recruiting as well. Stay aware of what people are doing. Unfortunately, my wife passed away, and they called back and said, would you consider being on the board? And, going through grief, you want to stay busy. I said, sure, I'll do it. So I go through more of an interview process, and then I get a call. Now, Fluence, joint venture of these two technology companies, they're in the battery energy storage space. And they called back and said, we'd like you to be chairman of the board. I'm like, well, I told you I gave a speech at the White House on energy, but I am not an energy expert. I want to make sure I didn't misrepresent something. And they said, no. My board is international. I said, we've got plenty of energy experts. And this is what I want the military people on the phone, all of us to listen to. They said, what we want is your leadership. Now think about that. I am not, now I'm learning, obviously I've been chair of this board. We went public, raised $1 billion on the NASDAQ, went public, and, COVID was tough because we had a lot of our batteries from China and, just everything going, but I'm so proud to lead this team. And the point that was made to me was we have plenty of experts. What we want is your leadership. So those of you in the military, those of you out of the military, your leadership is critical. And remember why I said you can lead from, right? From the back, from the middle, and the front. You want to exhibit those leadership characteristics.
Yeah, I've been feverishly taking notes while you've been talking about it. I suspect our entire audience has been doing the same thing. I want to stay on the theme of board dynamics. It leads into a question that came in from Bill Music out there about building alliances on the boards. You talked about the individual efforts to do that. Bill's question is there a way to formally integrate this into the board culture to help build these alliances and that you think is effective?
Yes, definitely so. And what you do is when new directors come on, you assign them a board buddy. Okay. And that board buddy, everything from, some boards I'm on are so formal that they're name tags and you know where to sit, right? And your new board member, you go in early and you say, hey, I'm going to be up here next to the chairman, and you pop down into Billy Bob's seat, and Billy Bob's been on the board for 15 years, and he walks in, or she, and sees you and says, what are you doing in my seat? So just having that board buddy. And what I do with the people, even if I'm not their official board buddy, I've just taken it upon myself. I'll talk to a person and I'll talk to them. I said, look, the first time you walk in that boardroom, I'm going to tell you, if you're not nervous, something's wrong with you. Okay. Despite you're a general officer, but you're going into a new environment, doing something you have not done before. And you need to be a little, when I say nervous, the butterflies that come, what am I going to say? How I'm going to say it. And then I say in the end, be yourself. Use what brought you to the game. Okay. But that board buddy concept is so important. If you don't have one, find someone that during the interview process that you really connected with, and call them and ask them, hey, how did I do? Okay. The older we get, the more fearful we are of feedback. But part of being a good board member, I think, is being transparent, the humility I talked about earlier, and also the authenticity. Those are just very, very important, critical issues that I think would make a very good board member.
Okay.
So so the sum of that is to seek feedback.
Perfect. Backing up just a little bit here, we have another question from Skip Langlois about advice on how to connect with board recruiters. They see the process of getting onto these boards. You talked about it a little bit, but any other advice about the board journey to a path to boards?
Yeah. Well, I think the headhunters, the board recruiters are critically important to the situation. But I can tell you of the boards that I've been on, they've probably been tangentially involved in two of them. Okay. And what do I mean by that? They're critical because they're going to do, Claudia and I both know that when we're on the board and we pick you to be on our board, if we pick somebody that is an axe murderer or something, we're going to be liable for it because we didn't do our due diligence, right? So we've got to do that. And the board search firms do that due diligence. So that is one thing there. If I think of every board that I've been on, it's been a result of a personal relationship and a referral. And let me tell you how it works. Hey, or whatever, next year, more likely. You got any ideas on people? Well, when boards were insulated, and let's talk by that meaning primarily white males, what do you think happened there? Who did they know? So they went to their friends and they went to their connections. And that's why that connectivity that I talked about is so important. And this brings me to a point of something that I taught about the difference between networking, which is critical, we ought to do, and connecting. Okay. Networking is transactional in nature. There's just no other way about it. Okay, it's not bad, but it's transactional. I'm going to do something for you, Patrick, and I'm going to get something in return for my time. Okay. I have espoused, and I hate to keep going back to that high school student council presidency, but I've espoused to a concept called connecting. Connecting is when you do something for or with someone without regards as to what you're going to receive in return. Okay. Now, if I knew exactly who to connect with, that would be great. And I wouldn't waste my time. And you can't look at it like that. The point I'm saying is that you've got to be consistent. You've got to be authentic in terms of your doing And as a result of connecting, hey, I wouldn't, because a board member, we're going to talk about how do you decide to go on a board. I think that's important. Board members want to be around people in the canoe with them. I have to use a Navy term in case we got some Navy people out there in the canoe with them that can row with them, because you're putting your brand and reputation at risk when you decide to join this organization. Think back to Enron, all those individuals that will never be on a board again. And it's because they sat there and they were with people that did not see something, say something. So I think that is critical. Right. So the board, so in like a good college professor, the roots are important that you are in the stadium. Okay, if you want to stay in the stadium and you're sitting back there waiting for somebody to tap you on the shoulder, once you're established, that will happen. Okay, the hardest board to get is your first one.
Right. I have one last audience question before I'll bring it back to you and give you an opportunity to share your final thoughts and close out with this. But this last question comes in from Mike Hughes. Wants to know whether you have any thoughts on boards being asked to respond to either political or cultural issues out there. I know for the military folks, we always remain strictly apolitical, so this is very new territory for the veterans. There's been pushback on ESG efforts over the past year. We also have the Gaza war, I know, which has been dividing students and views on campuses. Any thoughts on how boards can contend with some difficult issues like this?
Sure. Well, what I do, and this has been particularly important to me or effective for me, and being a board chairman. Okay, again, when you're the board chairman, you have the ability to what? The agenda. Agendas are so powerful, right? Because the agenda determines what you're going to talk about, and the board chair gets to finalize that, so to speak. And with that, I espouse to the stakeholder capitalism concept. Okay, and why does the corporation exist? Okay. And we know, Milton Friedman tell you, it exists for the shareholders and the shareholders only. However, I say that there are three other constituencies that we need to be involved with and think about. And let's start with your employees. They are critical. And in this day, you're going to have employees, obviously, with this fractured political and the geopolitical issues that are going on, are going to be a way, but you got to put a lens on it. I can't tell you what the answer is, but it's the lens. Your employees, then you've got to think about your suppliers. Okay, think about COVID and when you could not get what you needed to do your basic thing. You've got to think about your suppliers, short-term and long-term. Then you've got to think about the communities in which you operate. And then, of course, the shareholders. So that constrained box will at least give you some clarity on how is it that you respond to all of these critical issues. So you take someone like Jamie Dimon, right? Jamie will speak out. He has a bully pulpit and he uses it accordingly. However, I got a feeling that his communications people, they're going through that framework that I just talked about. Okay. So good leaders have conviction, they have purpose, and they're able to go somewhere, and they're going to be controversial decisions that have to be made. And you make those controversial decisions. If you use that framework, I think it will help you make those decisions in a way, because we know in this day and age we live in, you're not going to make everybody happy. It is sort of like being a parent in a way, right? So you know it's not going to make your kid happy. However, you're going to do what you think is in their best long-term interest. And that's no different, I think, than the corporation.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, getting ready to close out, I want to give you an opportunity to share your final thoughts with our audience.
Well, my final thoughts, I'm going to say a couple things, okay? And we talked about this earlier. To whom much is given, much is expected, right? So you've been a leader, you've done great things, continue to do that. And I always like to close out, because the human element, despite AI, and we didn't talk about that much at all, despite AI and large language models and all the great things that are going to happen, in the end, it still comes down to people. Okay. And I think some of you will recognize this quote. And I'll say the quote first and I'll say who said it. Some people may forget what you say. Some people may forget what you do, but people will never forget how you make them feel. And that's Maya Angelou. And if you remember that, that feeling is so important. And believe it or not, to put it all together, that feeling comes back to the connecting that I talked about earlier. Remember when I said connecting is when you're willing to do something for or with someone without regard as to what it's going to mean for you.
Thank you, Herman. You have made us feel very good about joining you here this morning. I want to share with our audience that Herman is doing this from vacation out of the country. So if you notice some glitchiness on the Wi-Fi there, that's why, but it also reflects his deep commitment to this community to share and give back to us, even while he's supposed to be with his family on vacation. So Herman, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I want to also thank the NorCal chapter, and then of course, Dr. Keith Dorsey and Boyden for sponsoring this effort.